Thank you. And I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure to be here as a participant. So 12 minutes on culture, religion, and human rights.
We told her 10. See, we're arguing.
And also say something about applying what we've learned. Okay, so I'm going to touch on some of these themes from the perspective of the work that I've been doing recently. And I've been working in particular on women in Islam in America. And as part of that, I've been following out also the larger public conversation today in America and Europe in relation to women and Islam. With respect to that larger conversation, it's clear that it's clearly the case that the subject of women in Islam has skyrocketed into high visibility in this post-9/11 era, and that it carries today a tremendous undertow of political significance. This topic, and most specifically not just women in Islam, but the oppression of women in Islam, now often figures in the media under a variety of guises, usually through a reference to the veil. The Chador of Afghanistan, some of you may remember when we first went to war in Afghanistan, was constantly in the media, and it was an easy way of both evoking at once the brutality of the Taliban and the moral justice of the war. In addition, the veil or hijab or headscarf is also a recurring theme in European political conversations, where talk of banning it is ongoing on the ground that it imports religion into secular space, and or that it is a sign of Islam's inherently patriarchal commitments, which are fundamentally at odds, it's claimed, with Western values, and in particular gender equality. These broad themes in our public narratives as to the perils of veiling and of Islam's supposedly unique oppressiveness towards women are not, of course, new to Western discourse. Their history goes back to early colonial times, but today they are re-emerging with renewed vigor. Such is the terrain in which we work and which forms the backdrop of our discussions of religion, culture, and human rights. Embedded as we are in the texture of our times, many of us surely are inevitably influenced by such narratives, even those of us explicitly working to contest their hidden and not so hidden agendas. Let me give an example from my own work. I began my research on women in Islam in America in the late 90s because I was surprised by the growing veiling trend among the young, and my assumption was that this perhaps seemed to imply acceptance of patriarchal notions. The trend was in addition alarming to me because the style of hijab I was seeing reminded me of the hijabs I saw as a child worn by the women of the Muslim Brotherhood, and only the women of the Muslim Brotherhood. I thought it unlikely that the Brotherhood could possibly have influence in America, but I was wrong. In fact, many of the major American Muslim institutions were founded by the Muslim Brotherhood or by people connected with them. And the reason the veil is here is very much to do with the Islamic revival, which was energized by the Muslim Brotherhood, which occurred in Egypt in the 70s and has now spread across the world. So, as I said, some of the major Muslim organizations, such as the Islamic Society of North America, or ISNA, were founded by people with connections to the Brotherhood. Or with other Islamists. And Islamist, I should explain, is the term that's now used in the scholarship to mean people connected with the Islamic revival of the 70s and later, and who, by and large, experts agree are non-violent and committed to non-violence. So armed with this knowledge, I continued my study to see how this kind of Islam was developing in America in relation to women. And in fact, my findings completely overturned my initial assumptions which were in sync with the grand narratives of our times as regards veiling as inherently affirming of male patriarchy, as I'd assumed, and as to the presumption of the dangers of the link to the Muslim Brotherhood and the assumption that it's always negative for women. For one thing, in the context of Western societies where Muslims are minorities, the veil has been cut loose from its old patriarchal meanings and now has a plethora of meanings, including among them the affirmation of gender justice. Similarly, my initial expectations were reversed when I followed out the activism of organizations such as ISNA, of women in those organizations. Often, these women were active in pursuing issues of justice for women, issues that in their eyes they were pursuing not because they were feminists, which is not how they see themselves, but out of their religious commitment to social justice. And for American Muslim women, social justice often typically includes justice also for women. So besides making clear to me my own prior implicatedness by virtue of my initial assumptions in the powerful Western narratives of our times, these findings also underscored another point, which in this case was not in fact a surprise, that is that Islam is being interpreted in America in a variety of ways, among them in ways that fully engage with and reflect the democratic society in which they are located. Such findings underscored, in other words, the fact that Islam is essentially no different from, no more intrinsically patriarchal than other major religions. I'm not, of course, claiming that all forms of Islam in America will necessarily endorse values of justice, social justice inclusive of women, but I'm simply confirming that, as is clearly the case with some forms of Christianity and Judaism, some forms of Islam, too, will continue to insist on the primacy of male dominance, while other forms will challenge that. So these are some of the things that have challenged my assumptions as regard religion, culture, and women's rights. Other events of our times similarly challenge old assumptions, among them the revolution sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. To say just a word in relation specifically to Egypt, we've had before us the spectacle of people, in particular young people, by the hundreds of thousands, even millions, risking their lives in a peaceful movement fueled by the desire for democracy, freedom, dignity, and human rights. Women, Christian and Muslim, hijabi and non-hijabi, formed part of the movement. And women were also among those whose words first inspired and ignited the movement. So while it's true that a call for equality for women has not explicitly been part of the revolutionary agenda, it's certainly there implicitly in women's activism and participation in the revolution. True, the economic and political empowerment of women is still a goal to be worked for, but what has already been achieved is certainly to be celebrated. What light, one might ask, does this revolutionary movement in the Arab world cast, for example, on the remarks made recently by Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, and David Cameron, British Prime Minister, to the effect that multiculturalism is a failure in their countries, above all because Muslims, apparently, are incapable of adapting to the Western values of democracy and equality? How come Muslims in Cairo and Tunis are capable of being fired by a desire for liberty, democracy, and a fair and equitable society, but not apparently Muslims living in Berlin or London? The passion for pursuing social justice evident among American Muslim women is clearly also in evidence in the revolutions now rolling across the Muslim world, the Arab world. These shared desires among the younger generation are now surging forward across the seemingly hard boundaries of religion, culture, and even national boundaries. It may be then that these old categories are losing their usefulness today, but perhaps they belong now to a past and passing era. Now to turn to applying what we've learned. My own direct experience of the practical application of knowledge in relation to religion, culture, human rights comes exclusively from my serving as a member on the board of Women's Learning Partnership, the organization about which we've heard a lot today, and which works mainly, as Mahnaz mentioned earlier, in the Global South. As board member, I followed the activities of WLP, and I attended meetings where I listened to inspirational women, such as you've heard today, describing their work in their different communities. Invariably, of course, I was moved, inspired, and impressed. I was always impressed, too, by the way that the WLP does its grassroots work in ways that are essentially free, so it seems, of the kinds of assumptions that are part of the grand narratives of our day about women and Islam. In fact, the gulf between the implicit presumptions underlying these grand narratives on the one hand and the useful, practical, and thoughtful work of support offered by WLP on the other seemed to me so striking that I found myself thinking that it might be a very good idea if WLP expanded their reach beyond the Global South, and if, say, Angela Merkel and David Cameron were to call them in to help them out, sort out their problems.